Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Matt Bowes. I'm the general manager here at New West. And with me today is Margaret Macpherson, author of the new memoir, Tracking the Caribou Queen. How are you today, Margaret?
Oh, good, Matt. I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm getting ready to go to Frankfurt, so got a lot of balls in the air. But yeah, it's an exciting part of the year. We're getting all the fall books out and getting them into the hands of readers, and you'd love to see it.
Yeah, and I'm getting ready to jet back to Edmonton, my homeland, or at least near my homeland, so I can do a huge number of book launches and try to get this baby out into the world. So I'm excited too.
Yeah. So, do you think you could tell our listeners a little bit about what this book's trying to accomplish? Because this isn't so much like a picaresque, like here's a bunch of stuff that happened to me. This is like a pretty focused, like here's some events from my history that kind of shaped the person I am and my worldview.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I could tell you it was picaresque and pastoral and beautiful, bucolic, but it's not. I mean, I had to do some fairly serious work in the last decade around my own relationship to um, Indigenous, my own background as a colonist in Indigenous territory in the Northwest Territories as a child, and moreover, my attitudes. Just contemplating whose land it was, how what my reaction as a young woman and as a girl, what my reaction to Indigenous people was, how we were in many ways kept very separate. I had to look at my own privilege, my own whiteness, uh, own it, see that indeed I was part of that, the part of the problem that Canada is facing now as a country that really has to own its past. And I had to dig in, and I had to recognize that I was a participant. I was reading a lot of trauma narratives and recognizing in a deep way that I was part of that. I was
Hmm.
perpetuating that. So, but I'm a white person, and I have to, I worry about where my voice sits in all this. So I had to write from a very heart centered place and try just to tell my own
Hmm.
story of being white in Yellowknife, being privileged in Yellowknife, being a perpetrator of racism through a
Hmm.
systemic system that infiltrated my being as a child.
Yeah, so the book takes place from what, like the mid 60s to early 70s, and it's your growing up in Yellowknife and interacting with Indigenous people there, interacting with white people there, and just kind of commenting and seeing from afar the way that Indigenous people were treated by the government and by their fellow citizens, right?
Yeah, including myself as
Yeah.
a fellow citizen, which I'm not big on the confessional narrative. I'm I struggled mightily to tell stories, to tell my story in a way that is engaging and true to the people that I encountered along the way. And in that, some pretty dark stuff came up. And the reflection, I mean, memoir is story, it's scene setting, and then reflection upon that scene. And the reflection was hard. The notion that um, my family, myself, my little white world was structured and sort of predicated upon keeping Indigenous people down and
Hmm.
keeping them like seeing this well the colonist point of view, the settler point of view, And it's nothing I'm proud of. And it's so contradictory to say I'm not proud of the work I did in this book. But I'm not proud of my own participation in this action. And I felt the best thing I could do was to write about it, because I do know how to write, and I want to write, and I want to lend my voice as a reaction to these trauma narratives, and say, yes, yes. Self-examination has shown me thus, thus, and thus. And I really want Tracking the Caribou Queen to be not a window, but rather a mirror for other readers. Like, my life is not, it's not particularly exciting, but it does, I think, in story and scene, sort of show a kid coming up. I mean, I went to Yellowknife. I was a child. I think I was 18 months when I arrived, maybe a bit older, maybe 2. But, you're surrounded by a society that you don't understand, and you're protected from that society by people who don't understand, i.e. your parents. And yeah, I found my memories were difficult to process, and they also really pierced me, as a 63-year-old writer. And it was a very challenging book for me to write, because I had to see my sort of raw ugliness, and and to be a true ally, we really can't be that until we say, hey, I I I participated in the past.
Now you
I mean,
benefited in a colonial system,
I benefited.
which we still do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know. But how do we begin to advocate for, for others, if we don't see ourselves as culpable? That's,
Yeah.
I guess, the question my book attempts to ask. I mean, it's compounded by the fact that my father was, he went up as a teacher. He ended up being the director of education. I worked in the residential component of the high school that I went to. Um, you know, that it's really recent history. It's my own lifetime. And
hmm
so I think the proximity to history is really close in the territories. I'm recounting something that happened 50 years ago as a child. And I'm also really reaching back into memory, and the vagaries of memory, and trying to put something on the page that has at least a component of, um I don't even know what the word is, Matt. Maybe responsibility,
mm
maybe compassion, maybe. But it's so easy to misinterpret that as, some white chick with privilege. And I admit that's who I am.
Yeah, something I like about the book is that it kind of deflates a bit of Canadian national mythology, because you remember when the TRC came out and people are saying, "Oh, I don't remember that. I'd never heard about this." And what I think your book mentions and kind of makes clear is that people at the time probably didn't know all the specifics of what was going on, but they knew something was up. They didn't they knew that this system was doing something to Indigenous people and marginalizing them, and they were benefiting from this, and they might not have been able to internalize it at this point, but I think a lot of people have now. But do you think like people at the time didn't, like, they say they didn't know what was going on, but they knew, right?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I remember being at the hostel when I was just a child. Like, there were suppers there and meetings there and stuff like that. And I remember the hallways. There was the boys' dorm and the girls' dorm, and they were tiled, long, dark corridors going to these bedrooms that had, 4 kids per room. I think, yeah, 4 kids per room. And there was this sort of a, even in my, I was a pretty sensitive kid, and even in my child's heart, I just felt that sense of being separated from
Hmm.
your family. And I just thought, what would that be like? And a, a huge empathy, and actually not even really being able to comprehend what that would be like, but feeling it nonetheless. So, um, when you say, did we know? Did we know? In some cases, people knew, and in some cases, I sort of knew intuitively
Hmm.
how kind of dark and frightening the whole system was. I remember not liking being there
Hmm.
and feeling that things outside my realm were taking place that I couldn't begin to understand, and yet it made me uncomfortable. But that was as a very, very young child. And then, you become cavalier as a
Yeah.
teenager, you become very egocentric and self-centered. And, I had a very strong sort of religious time where I thought, I was like the missionary saving people. And really what the book tries to explore is the tropes that have materialized, like the notion of the noble savage, I think is equally as damning and damaging to indigenous peoples, as is the opposite stereotype of,
Hmm.
the sort of uh drinking, hard partying, sort of trap line person at the bar.
They're both
It's
very reductive.
They're both very reductive, and yet they're perpetuated. and
Hmm.
and I, we need to get away from that. The way to get away from it, I think, is to expose it and say,
Hmm.
this is wrong, this is what I thought, and it's wrong, and here's how it's wrong. This is what I thought, this is another way I thought, and it too is wrong, and here's how it's wrong. So, but only in laying out my own story, not in, this is not a, a didactic telling people how to respond. As I said earlier, I like to think of Tracking the Caribou Queen as a mirror. And it's not Yellowknife in the 60s and 70s. It's every town
Hmm.
in the 60s and 70s, Matt. It's every place that held, this nation to nation agreement that we made, that our forefathers made, keeping those things not only apart, but dishonoring that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I can go on and on. What was your question?
I was wondering, you know, and I think you answered it, that people knew. They might not have known the specifics, but they known that something was up. And depending on if they were racist or not, they were thought that that was a good thing or a bad thing. That this
Some,
society is being bifurcated into indigenous person and settler person,
but
a
some
term that
people,
would not have even come up at the time.
no,
Both
but
of
some
those
people
terms.
also didn't know. Like the product of your times is something that's very real. And I remember this in a book I wrote about Nellie McClung. She was a eugenist. She was
Yeah.
a feminist. She was a suffragette. She believed in the rights of women, but she was also a eugenist. So, you know, how do you hold those two things? And
Hmm.
polarity is what the book holds. So some people, I felt quite a one of the most difficult things about writing Caribou Queen was a sense of betraying my father, whom I adored. He died when I was quite young. I was 23 years old, and he was a huge egalitarian, CCF, like, a member of Tommy Douglas's Saskatchewan, and he was beloved by Indigenous and white people alike. And he was a product of his time. I
Hmm.
don't think intentionality, the notion that he would subjugate an entire race, I don't think that was ever part of his thinking. And maybe I have to believe that as his daughter,
Yeah.
but it's, I'm wrestling. I'm wrestling these concepts, these constructs in this book, and trying to lay them out and let the reader be the judge. But
Hmm.
I do think, you know, there's a nefarious, patriarchal, misogynistic side of government, absolutely.
Hmm.
But there are also people who didn't, wanted to. How do we take people from tiny little settlements and give them the tools that will help them um, find employment, gainful employment in a colonial world? So, those questions are, I think they're laced throughout the tapestry of this book. And I like to think that there there aren't really answers, but there are reflections
Hmm.
of some new way of thinking.
Hmm. So I remember, I think earlier on when we first contracted this book, you told me that you'd actually tried to write it as a novel first, and I do find that it is not didactic in the way you were mentioning before. It is kind of just like filtered through your experiences, but I think it does have a novelistic approach, and I think that that actually helps the reader empathize with you as a character more, because you're not just like, here's a bunch of factoids. It's more like, here's a person's progression from, you know, being very naive up to, willing to put the work in by the end. But why didn't it work as a novel?
Well, clearly it didn't work as a novel because I mean, I shouldn't say clearly. It didn't work as a novel because, I have no idea what it's like to be Indigenous.
Yeah, you can only write your half of it then, and
Well,
then
that's
that
right.
you're losing a big chunk of the story in
Yeah,
that
and
case.
and it's vain ego, and it's and I mean, I had to learn that. Like,
Hmm.
I thought, oh, the writer can write anything, and I can be male, and I can be East Asian, or I could be anything I wanted. Well, that was the work of pulling out. So the novels, I mean, I've been working on this for so long I can't even begin to remember, but I it started as a uh sort of a meditation on grief. And the place you come from, I come from Yellowknife. I will always come from Yellowknife. It's where I grew up. It's where all my formative moments happened in my life. But I left when I was 17. I
Hmm.
went out to university, um, and many people didn't have that opportunity. But like, for me, the novel was going back and really just a way into memory. And I started remembering things that I'd actually kind of compartmentalized and blocked out. I hadn't thought about the hostel at Cato Hall for years. I hadn't thought about it. I was probably 54-year-old woman when I started this book. And I started thinking about places, Rat Lake and Suicide Corner, and just the various landscapes of my childhood. And they came back so powerfully. Around the same time, a little story here, if you don't mind. My mother I think she just passed away. It was in 92. And I was rooting through an old storage shed, and I found this tray, Matt, this it was probably silver plated, but this heavy tea service tray, and on it was etched something like 1964, in commemoration of Norm Macpherson's um, expedition to the Eastern Arctic, government of the Northwest Territories, a crest on an emblem of the Northwest Territories on the tea tray, a great heavy thing, like no better symbol of colonial.
Hmm.
Here's people in the high Arctic struggling to survive, and the government is giving out
Tea.
tea trays to
Yeah.
commemorate it. And
Itself a colonial
oh,
drink,
yeah,
basically.
well, yeah. And I took this tray, and I saw that my dad's name was etched on it, and I thought, My mother, she wasn't going to give it to Value Village. She didn't know what to do with it. It was probably
Mhm.
valuable. It was probably shameful. It was shameful to me. I held it in my hands and I thought about cups of tea. I thought about, what it would be like ku- kudlooks. And I thought about my father's journey up there in those tiny settlements on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and the people, the real people, not this commemorative tea tray. And I felt the heaviness and the weight of my own actions and the conviction that I needed to do something to try to set it right. And I wrote an essay because that's what I do. I always turn to the page and I wrote an essay, which in some ways was the beginning of Tracking the Caribou Queen. The tea tray eventually got erased, and I've never told that story, but it's yeah, that symbolism and that need to dive in and do some reflection and do some work and go back to those old places and see them the way they were, not the
Mhm.
way I wanted them to be, but the way they were, and see that little we used to call this area Rainbow Valley, and it was sort of romanticized in my mind. It was this romantic, these little houses, and to understand that 200 indigenous people lived in these 20, 400 square foot shacks on the edge of the
Mhm.
lake. And uh, yeah, well,
Is that
it's
where the guy who rescued you when you tried to ski across the ice
no,
lived?
that was Detta. That was
Oh,
the village. That was the original village
because
across.
that's such a good metaphor for you being quite naive at the time. Like, oh yeah, we could ski across that, and no, you cannot. It is very, very difficult terrain, and you had to get rescued. So that
Well,
that really
yeah,
showed like you're kind of, maybe a
yeah.
little bit sheltered at that point.
Oh my gosh, Matt. Like
Not
sheltered
not to
and
insult you, but like, yeah, it's like the character at the time, she thought that she could do it.
sheltered and yet unprotected. Like
Yeah.
that again, the polarity of those things. Like we used to run the bush all the time. And I think as a female too, there was a
Mhm.
little bit more danger than I certainly was aware of. And I think my parents kept wanted us to have a childhood and wanted us to be somewhat unaware of the dangers in a place like a northern mining town. And I think
Mhm.
many women who read Tracking the Caribou Queen will understand that there's a there's something about being a female there too, and that's why the image of the queen
Mhm.
and is
Femininity in general, yeah.
yeah, and is potent in the work, or I like to think it is potent in the work. um yeah, that scene of crossing the ice was like I ran into a whiteout. I mean, I didn't plan to be on the ice when the clouds rolled in and suddenly I couldn't see anything. And that being picked up in that comic was like it saved my life, I'm convinced. And yet the woman I was with was still, was reluctant to not she I don't think she was reluctant to be grateful, but she was not wanting, like, the kindness that was demonstrated to us wasn't reciprocated
Mm.
to the people who were our rescuers. And
Mhm.
you see that in I always think of the treaties when they were signed. We weren't invited by Indigenous people to Canada, yet we were welcomed.
Mhm.
Yet we were welcomed.
Over and over again.
Yeah, over and over again. So yeah, I'm grappling with a lot. I I was a kid. I was just a kid, and as you say, kind of a naive kid, kind of a positive, everything I could try to put a positive spin on it. So we've got somewhat of an unreliable narrator, a bit of a
Mhm.
storybook girl. And that's really important to me because, I mean, some people are born and the glass is half full. Well, I'm still like that. But when I look at it, maybe it was just my glass that was half
Hmm.
full.
A lot of non-full glasses up there for sure.
Yeah, yeah, Matt. And yeah, I mean, it's embarrassing coming to this truth at the age of 60. But if I can, if I can be as honest as possible and try to own my part in the colonialist narrative, then maybe somebody else might, and somebody else might, and somebody else might. I mean, it's a book for the for white readers. I
Mhm.
you know, and anybody can read this book, but I think it's really holding up a mirror to those of us who are settlers, and
Mhm.
I and admitting that we have so far to go and so much to learn, and I have so far to go and so much to learn. So my
Mhm.
hope is, of course, that this journey, that by sharing my story, I might help others reflect on their own stories, and together we could somehow elevate um, the people, the people of Canada, the people who were indigenous to these parts, who were welcoming and continue to welcome. And I just hope that there's some redemption in the narrative of Canada, that there
Mhm.
can be. And I do think the book has a hopeful message at the end. It's
Mhm.
not all, oh, we're so, I don't know, where it's not, we're so caught up in ourselves that we can't see beyond.
Irredeemable.
Yeah, we're irredeemable. We can't see beyond our own noses. I don't think it ends that way, but
No, I
you
wouldn't
know,
say so either. It ends in a, it doesn't end definitively anywhere, but it's more like, here's a place you could start from.
that's right. That's right. It's opens, if anything, I want this to open a conversation, have a
Mhm.
dialogue with, with whoever wants to talk about these hard truths,
Mhm.
because not everybody does and not everybody's ready.
Yeah,
But we
there's
better
definitely a
get
lot of
ready.
people who would rather all this lay in the past and not think of their own history with it. But you've got a sample from the book for our listeners. Why don't you set that up?
Oh, okay. This is not skiing across the lake. This is just an example of the writing. Um, and I'll set it up by telling you that it comes, I don't know, about a third through. We had been in Yellowknife almost 6 years when Paul, my elder brother, went out with some other 14-year-old boys and came home, boasting of killing a ptarmigan on Tin Can Hill. It was just standing there like a dupe. We were in the kitchen of the house by the school. The kettle had just boiled, and the air was thick and steamy, so everything in that room appeared malleable and soft around the edges. Paul, however, stood ramrod straight and shouldered an imaginary rifle. As he looked down its barrel through the sights, his cheeks puffed and collapsed, a muted explosion issuing from his mouth. There was blood, lots of it. He looked to my mother, who was pressing one of my father's shirts on the kitchen counter, a white towel beneath her task. Or it looked like there was lots, he faltered, because of the snow. We were all listening, but it was 11-year-old Will who was awed. His eyes sparkled, killing something, hunting. It's what Yellowknife boys did. And now Paul, slight, pale Paul, had killed a bird. It was a radical, cool, almost as though Will had done it himself. How much blood, Paul? Were there feathers and guts? Did you blow it to bits, Paul? Did you? Did you? But before my oldest brother could answer, a strangled sound came from my mother's throat. It wasn't loud, but it stopped all other sounds in that blurry, closed kitchen. It was an agony we had not heard before. Ned looked scared. I was shocked. Paul was immediately silenced. Only Jennifer, my sister, spoke. Mom? The sound continued, a deep guttural gasp. It was not the iron hitting the countertop, nor the rasp of the cord across the canister set. It was my mother imitating some in the throes of death. Her face was like Dad's shirt. What did that bird ever do To you, Paul. The iron hung midair, hissing in space. And before anyone could answer, she slowly and deliberately placed the hot iron down on the shirt. What did it do to you? She asked again, putting both hands on her hips. What did that bird do, Paul, to make you want to kill? We looked at my brother squirming. The hot weighted iron began to scorch the cloth, Dad's good work shirt. We could smell the burn, but our mother did not move. She just waited. Nothing. There were tears in that single word, and I prayed for them to come, to stay the iron, to cool the scorch, but there was no release. Say it. Smoke or steam or a mixture of both was rising from the dress shirt. My mother ignored everything except her eldest child. It did nothing. It didn't do anything to me. Tears sprang to Paul's eyes. His bravado evaporated. That's right, said my mother, pulling the hot iron up from its haunches. It didn't do anything to you. That bird did nothing to deserve to die. And then she peered down at the dark spade on my dad's shirt, as if she had no idea how it got there. Blood on the snow, my word, she muttered. And then quickly looking up, commanded Paul, go wash your face. The rest of you scram, I have to get ready for work. The next weekend, my brothers and I went to Tin Can Hill together to see Paul's kill site. Jennifer would not come. She was listening to the monkeys on the radio and learning how to backcomb and style her hair. She pursed her lips at me when I asked her to come with us, made a kissing sound in the air. I didn't know exactly what it meant, except no. Paul had been grounded. Are you kidding? I'm never going there again. It's not that great. Come on, Paul, Will cajoled. It'll be fun. But in the end, we went without him. It's because he bawled, said Will. That's why he doesn't want to come. Yeah, can't blame him. He's a big ball baby, said Ned, to win Will's favor. But a loyalty rose in me and I kicked him in the ankle, so he shut up. Paul's guilty tears were not to be mocked. Tin Can Hill lay over the brow of the plain where the new town was constructed, smoothed out and separated beyond Sir John Franklin, the school, our usual boundary. Tin Can Hill beckoned from the narrow draw between Great Slave Lake and the Con Mine Road, where a few new houses were still under construction. One had a floor and a framed structure. The other was a foundation with spring water gathered in the hole. It's a swimming pool, said Ned. We can go swimming. I contemplated the brown water, bits of lumber and pink insulation floating on the surface. I don't think we should swim here. It's somebody's property. The three of us continued to lean over the concrete wall. Leaky basement, said Will. They're going to have a mighty wet cellar. It struck us as funny all at the same time, and we laughed and trudged on, chanting leaky, leaky. Ned changed our call to sneaky leaky, and Will dubbed the brown water streaky leaky, which made us think of toilets and underwear, and we laughed harder as we trekked towards the head frame of the mine. Tin Can Hill was situated halfway between Con Mine Road and the construction site. It was a different dumping site, a collection of garbage from the shack town that sprang up on the shores of Great Slave in the mid-90s. But something in the volume of rusting cans, can upon can, was crude music to our ears. So much so, my brothers and I clambered over the bank of the tip and pawed through the last of the slush and the snow to uproot the old cans. The spring snow absorbed the rusty orange residue, and it was beautiful beneath the blue, blue sky. The air was light and smelled like sap letting go. There were willows reaching for the sun, and on black spruce, a thick ooze on the bark. As we scrambled through winter's leavings, the knees of our snow pants and the palms of our mittens became wet and streaked with rust from the ancient foreign materials we were liberating from the snow. Here's one, here's another. And we flung the tin cans up in the air, sending bits of moss and lichen spinning airborne. We dug and pawed the surface, unearthing layer upon layer of discarded cans, and we threw them aloft, a mad gusto, spurred by the shift in season. Let's pretend we're Indians, real Indians who can live off the land, cried Will, rubbing his midden hand across his cheek, staining his face with streaks of ochre and grime. You be the chief, said Ned to my older brother, and he held his own face still as Will rubbed rust into his freckles to make him brown. Now we can kill ptarmigan, I yelled as I smeared the rust across my own forehead and chin, hungry to feel the transition, the transformation that I saw in my brothers. Now we can hunt, shouted Will, and he uprooted the dead foal, a slender branch, and swung it above his head, a whipping stick, a raised firearm. We fell in line, something loosened within us, and my younger brother and I grabbed sticks too, and we marched down Tin Can Hill, blasting a flock of imaginary ptarmigan as we headed home, marked as original copper people, orange painted warriors, giddy and carefree. So that is an excerpt from Caribou Queen. I don't know if that was the best one to read, but it's where the book opened.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly showing what you thought as a very young child, and then you get better later.
Yeah,
You've got a few events coming up, though. Do you want to let our listeners know about those?
Yeah, I have a lot of events coming up. I'm really excited. I get to do a master class at LitFest about memoir writing, which I've really just this is my first. I'm way too young to write a memoir, but I sort of learned about it. The process of learning about writing memoir has been through writing a memoir, and so I'm talking about writing about your family. It's called Writing About Your Family, how to write about your family and still have one. And these are difficult, they're difficult and sort of delicate ways to tell a story, because of course so many other people are implicated in that. So that's a masterclass with LitFest. I get to go to Saskatoon and read with a fellow named Dave Carpenter, a fellow advertised as a raconteur of Saskatchewan, who's written a book of essays, and he's presenting with me in Saskatoon on the I'm trying to think of the date, the 27th. So that'll be really fun to read with a local fellow. He's a very fine writer and just sort of a master of talking about the wild and why the wild animals matter, and particularly the predator. So I think there could be some really interesting crossover in the story of the colonist and the stories of the predator and the wild world and the natural world and then the colonized world. So I'm I have no idea how that will play out, but I'm really looking forward to that reading. And then of course I come back to Edmonton and I get to launch the book in Edmonton, which is my heart's desire. The book was conceived in Edmonton. It took me 12 years to put it together, and I'm having a launch at Bonnie Doon Hall, a great venue. It's sort of in my neighborhood, more or less, and I've invited 3 Indigenous artists to share in that event. I certainly don't want my own white voice in the room. I have invited poets to read, carte blanche, whatever they want to read, so the audience can hear from people who are living the experience of urban Indigenous people in Edmonton. We need to hear those voices. I've invited an editor, Rhonda Cronk, to do an interview with me. She can ask all the hard questions, and hopefully I can respond appropriately. I'm excited about this launch more than the others because it's sort of important for me that this sort of sends the book out into the world with the right attitude. I've invited Lana Whiskey Jack to do an opening sacred space for us and blessing the book as it goes out into the world, because a book, once it's out of your hands, it has its own life, and readers bring their world to what they read. So I want a blessing on the book, and I'm so grateful that somebody's willing to do that for me. And I'm humbled by that too. So yeah, that'll be a really exciting, um, invigorating time, a chance to celebrate, a chance to contemplate and reflect, and really hopefully mark the beginning of maybe the change that we need to see in in this country. After that, it's a road trip. I'm going to Nelson, where I'm doing a reading at a bookstore, hopefully Fernie, and the whole little mini tour culminates in Calgary on November 8th, where I'm doing a reading with another essayist, another nonfiction writer.
Mika Jacobson.
Yeah, Mika. But no, I wasn't thinking of her name. I was thinking about her stories,
Oh,
her
yeah,
essays. Yeah.
yeah.
And so that'll be really fascinating because she contemplates some of the other things, the in nonfiction, some of the things that I'm kind of looking at, being a white person, and how to, what is appropriation, and how have we appropriated, and w- w- what are our responsibilities as privileged entitled people. Some of the same questions I think are really rich and resplendent in her work, and I'm looking forward to hearing from her. I believe her book is already launched, but I think it's kind of going to be another really good melding of two works.
Hmm.
So, oh, and I forgot to mention, in Nelson, I'm working with a Radiant Press author, Elizabeth Haynes. Her book came out in the pandemic. It's called The Errant Husband, and it's a novel. And she's a personal friend of mine, but also just an extraordinary writer. And so I'm working with a number of players from a number of different presses, and we're just sort of doing this little tour, very small tour, but it's at least bringing the Caribou Queen back to the northwest part of
Hmm.
Canada, and I'm just really grateful to be among my people, because I've moved out east and or central Canada, and I find this is a really different part of the world. But I do hope that Caribou Queen has the legs to make it out to the east, because honestly, even though racism is more evident in the West, and we see more Indigenous people, it's just that colonization it's been longer out here. Like
Hmm.
it's more some ways more subversive, and um, while there's this beautiful resurgence of Indigenous voices here, we're talking about 300 years of history and a greater suppression of that voice, and a greater, um, I would suggest, having only been here for a year, I would suggest that there has been um, almost more damage done in this part of Canada, and than than we see out west, where things are a little bit newer and closer to the surface. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's a yeah, I guess I have big plans, Matt.
Well, and you can check in the description for this episode for links to those events, and some of them have Eventbrites. I think the Masterclass does. So if you want to register for that, you can go there. And yeah, I'd love to see you out at one of these events for the book. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Margaret.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Matt. Good luck in the in Europe. That'll be a real hoot.
Thank you. So this is Matt Bose from New West Press Audio signing out.